Flight attendant refuses to give black girl water, not knowing her father owns the airline. At 35,000 feet, a child's cry for help was met. Not what Patricia didn't realize was that watching from first class mere rows away was Malcolm Johnson, a soft-spoken man in a custom suit known only to airline insiders as the majority owner of Skyway Airlines, the company that signed Patricia's paychecks, and the father of the girl she just refused to help. The chain of events that followed would not only expose one woman's prejudice, it would ignite a firestorm that rocked the aviation industry, triggered international headlines, and forced a multi-billion-dollar corporation to face its deepest, darkest failures. Before we dive into this shocking real story, comment below where you're watching from. And if you believe in justice, accountability, and standing up for what's right, hit that like button and subscribe now. This isn't just a story about racism on a plane. It's about how silence protects power until someone dares to speak. Zora and Malcolm Johnson, a father, a daughter, a dream before the headlines. Before the viral footage, before the confrontation at 35,000 feet, that would shake an entire industry, there was simply Zora and her father Malcolm, a duo bound by love loss and a promise to face the world together. Malcolm Johnson wasn't born into wealth. Raised in Harlem by working-class parents, he built his empire from nothing. He was a visionary investor, able to spot broken companies and breathe life into them. At 42, he had acquired a portfolio that spanned tech, media, and transportation. But no accomplishment meant more to him than raising his daughter after tragedy. Zora was just 5 when her mother Isla died from an aggressive cancer. Malcolm had stepped away from boardrooms and billion-dollar deals to become a full-time father. He cooked, he braided hair, he sat through late-night asthma scares and piano recitals. Their bond was forged not in luxury, but in shared grief and resilience. Despite his billionaire status, Malcolm kept a low profile. Few knew what he looked like even at his own companies. When he purchased Skyway Airlines 8 months before the incident, he made it clear, if I can't trust my airline with my daughter, I won't trust it with anyone. That's why he made a bold parenting choice for their upcoming trip to Paris. It was Zora's reward for finishing the school year with straight A's despite health challenges. She had managed severe food allergies and mild asthma while excelling in math, writing, and debate. Malcolm had booked the trip as a surprise, a week of museums, pastries, and Disneyland Paris. But instead of flying private as they usually did, Malcolm insisted they take a commercial flight on Skyway. He booked himself in first class, and Zora in premium economy. Privilege should be earned, not assumed, he had said when she questioned the decision. She had giggled. So I don't get first class just for being your daughter. You get trust, he replied, but comfort that you'll have to work for. Zora had understood. She always did. As they boarded that morning, Malcolm nodded at her proudly as she found her seat in row 14. He tucked into first class quietly, just a few rows away. From his window seat, he opened his laptop to review acquisition deals while glancing at Zora, her head pressed against the cabin window, eyes wide with excitement. Neither of them knew that sitting just beyond Zora's aisle was Patricia Whitfield, a 15-year veteran flight attendant with a glowing personnel file and a long, quiet history of discriminatory behavior that no one had ever bothered to document, or more accurately, that no one had ever cared enough to confront. Patricia prided herself on control. To her, the rules were sacred but selectively enforced. She greeted white passengers, warmly smiled at wealthy travelers with practiced charm, and stiffened when passengers like Zora stepped on board. She knew how to disguise disdain with professionalism, masking prejudice behind procedure. As Zora handed Patricia her boarding pass, she received no smile. Just a clipped 14B and a pointed glance at her oversized backpack. She brushed it off. She was used to being overlooked. Zora took her seat and settled in for the flight. She clutched a travel folder her father had packed for her: passport snacks, antihistamines, and her emergency epinephrine pen. Despite her health issues, she was prepared. Her father had raised her to be responsible. 2 hours into the flight, the crew served snacks. Zora carefully chose a sealed cookie packet and nibbled on it, flipping through a sketchbook. Minutes later, the first symptoms began. A tingling sensation on her tongue, a warm pressure in her throat. She froze. Her body had memorized this feeling. It was the start of an allergic reaction. She reached for her antihistamine, but she needed water to swallow the pill. She pressed the call button. Patricia walked past, glancing once at the illuminated light, then looking away. She turned her back to Zora and poured ginger ale for the white passenger across the aisle. Zora waited. Her throat tightened. 10 minutes passed. No one came. She pressed the button again this time, raising her hand slightly. Her breathing had started to quicken. Her lips tingled. Still, Patricia didn't come. When she finally approached, Zora could barely speak. "Please, water," she croaked. "Allergy," Patricia sneered. "You'll have to wait for the next service round like everyone else." Her voice was just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Zora blinked back tears. She wasn't asking for champagne, just water. Patricia walked away. In the seat behind Zora, 72-year-old Dorothy Chambers, a retired school teacher, frowned. She had noticed Patricia's tone. She had seen how other passengers were served without delay. And she was not the only one. A man across the aisle, Marcus Rivera, discreetly began recording on his phone. Zora pressed the button a third time. Patricia returned, turned it off with a loud click, and declared, "The button is for emergencies, not for impatient children." "But I need," Zora began. "You've made yourself clear," Patricia snapped before walking off. What Patricia didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that the man watching from first class was no ordinary passenger. And the child she had just humiliated wasn't just any girl. She had just ignored the daughter of the man who controlled the future of her entire airline. Ignored, isolated, and suffocating at 35,000 feet. The air grew thinner, not just from the altitude, but from fear. Zora Johnson, age 12, sat trembling in seat 14B, her throat swelling with every breath, her body desperately pleading for relief. The tingling in her mouth had turned to fire. Her tongue felt thick. Her chest tightened. She needed water. She needed her medication. And she needed help. But no one came. Flight attendant Patricia Whitfield had made her position clear. The call button denied. Requests ignored. Even her whispered, "Please, I have an allergy," had been dismissed with a glare and a bitter warning. "Wait like everyone else." Zora sat back, gripping her armrest, willing her body to calm down. But the reaction was accelerating. Her pill sat uselessly in her sweaty palm, impossible to swallow without water. All around her, passengers sipped their drinks and flipped through magazines. The woman beside her didn't yet notice anything wrong. Zora tried to speak, but her voice had shriveled into a wheeze. She reached up, pressed the button one more time. Across the aisle, Marcus Rivera, a 34-year-old marketing executive, lowered his in-flight magazine and stared. The same light had flashed 3 times. The same girl. He'd seen Patricia walk past her. Twice. He had filmed the first time out of curiosity. Now he recorded out of alarm. "Excuse me," Zora croaked as Patricia finally approached once again without eye contact. "Water? Please." "Allergy." Patricia reached up and turned off the light again. "I told you already," she said loudly. "The call button is for emergencies, not for entitled children who think they deserve special treatment." Zora's eyes filled with tears, not from hurt feelings, but from oxygen deprivation. In row 15, Dorothy Chambers stiffened in her seat. "That's enough," she murmured under her breath. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood despite the illuminated sign telling her to remain seated. "Excuse me," Miss Dorothy called out to Patricia. "That child is clearly unwell. She mentioned an allergy. Why are you ignoring her?" Patricia turned sharply. Her tone instantly shifted to icy professionalism. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. The situation is under control." "No," Dorothy said, her voice rising. "It is not under control. That girl is struggling to breathe." At that moment, the passenger next to Zora finally noticed the girl's flushed face and shallow, rapid breaths. "Are you okay?" she asked urgently. Zora shook her head. Her eyes had begun to glass over. The woman immediately handed her half a bottle of water. Zora grabbed it and took the pill, but it was already too late for antihistamines alone. She whispered, "Pen," pointing to her overhead bag. The woman leapt into action, opened the bin, and found the pen. Zora fumbled, trying to inject herself, but her hands were shaking too violently. That's when Patricia returned, having heard the commotion. "What's going on here?" she snapped. "She can't breathe," the woman shouted. "She's having a serious allergic reaction." Marcus stood now, his phone still recording. Patricia's face blanched only slightly, but her voice remained defensive. "She's being dramatic, probably just panicking." "These kids today," Patricia came a sharp voice from the galley. Carter Wilson, the junior flight supervisor, had finally intervened. He had been watching from a distance, hesitant, unsure. But now the scene was impossible to ignore. "What's happening here?" he asked. Before anyone could respond, Zora let out a tiny gasp and collapsed into the aisle. For a brief moment, the cabin fell silent. Then chaos erupted. A woman screamed. Someone called out, "She's not breathing." Dorothy Chambers pushed forward, shouting, "Is there a doctor on board?" "I'm a doctor," a man yelled, leaping from row 12 and kneeling beside Zora. "I need the emergency medical kit now." Carter froze. Patricia didn't move. "You heard him," Dorothy yelled. "Get the kit," the doctor. Alan Michaels checked Zora's pulse. "She's having an anaphylactic reaction. Her airway's closing. Epinephrine now." Patricia hesitated again, her eyes darting to Carter. "Get the damn kit," he shouted, finally snapping into command. He ran to the galley and retrieved the red case, handing it to Dr. Michaels. The injection was fast. Within moments, Zora began to wheeze slightly, a sign the airway might be opening again. But she was still pale, her body limp, her lips tinged blue. In first class, Malcolm Johnson's world shattered in a heartbeat. He had received a discreet message from a flight attendant, Olivia, that there was a medical issue involving a young girl in premium economy. He hadn't made the connection until he heard a passenger shout Zora's name. He was out of his seat instantly. When he reached the aisle and saw his daughter's body on the floor, he dropped to his knees. His hands trembled as he touched her face. "Zora, Zora, I'm here." Dr. Michaels glanced at him. "Are you her father?" Malcolm nodded. "She had an allergic reaction. We administered epinephrine. She should be okay for now, but she needs to be monitored." Malcolm looked around, his voice like ice. "Why wasn't she helped sooner?" No one answered. He turned and his gaze landed on Patricia. She stood frozen, silent. For the first time that flight, she looked unsure, scared. Malcolm's voice was low, calm, but sharp enough to cut through steel. "You ignored my daughter," repeatedly, while she begged you for water. Patricia's mouth opened. "Sir, there was a lot going on. I was following protocol. She never said it was urgent." "That's a lie," Dorothy Chambers interrupted. "She begged 3 times, and you mocked her. I have it on video," Marcus said, holding it up his phone. "Everything." Patricia paled. Carter Wilson stepped forward. "Sir, I had no idea she was your Malcolm," stood, his presence towering now. "You had no idea. That's exactly the problem." He pulled out a sleek card from his wallet and held it up to Patricia. "Malcolm Johnson, majority owner, Skyway Airlines." Patricia's face collapsed. The passengers gasped. And in that moment, everything shifted. Malcolm Johnson stood like a storm at the eye of the chaos. The gold-embossed business card in his hand felt heavier than it ever had before, not because of its weight, but because of what it now represented in this moment, the invisible power behind the curtain stepping forward. For 12 years, he had protected his daughter Zora from the world's worst edges. He had taught her to be composed, to be brave, and to understand the unspoken rules that came with living as a young black girl in spaces not built for her. But he had not expected to watch her nearly die under the roof of his own company. The silence that followed the revelation of his identity was crushing. Patricia's mouth moved, but no words came out. She was cornered, no script to read from, no senior manager to deflect to. Her face, just moments ago lined with smug dismissal, was now a battlefield of panic and damage control. I didn't know she was your daughter," Patricia stammered. Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His quiet intensity cut deeper. "And if she wasn't my daughter, would she still be lying unconscious in an aisle while you made jokes in the galley?" Patricia stepped back, trembling slightly. Her professional mask cracked. "I didn't mean—" "But you did," he interrupted. "Because what you said, what you did, and what you didn't do all align perfectly with what happens when people believe there are no consequences for ignoring a black child." Around them, the cabin had gone utterly still. Passengers were filming. Whispers traveled row to row. Flight attendants who had avoided eye contact with Patricia now physically stepped away from her, unwilling to be associated. Carter Wilson, the junior flight supervisor, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mr. Johnson, I deeply regret what's happened. I'll make sure this is handled correctly from here." Malcolm fixed him with a look that froze the apology on his lips. "No, Mr. Wilson. You'll make sure it's documented. I'll handle the rest." Olivia Chen, the first-class attendant, who had first alerted Malcolm, stepped forward quietly. "Sir, there's a crew rest area we can secure. We can play Whitfield there for the remainder of the flight." "Do it," Malcolm said, not looking at Patricia again. "She's to have no further contact with passengers." Carter hesitated. "But she's still senior." Malcolm turned to him. "Not anymore." A few minutes later, Patricia was quietly escorted to the rest quarters, humiliated eyes hollow, her legacy dissolving midair. Meanwhile, Zora had begun to stir. Her eyelids fluttered, and Malcolm dropped to his knees beside her. "Zora," he whispered. "It's me. You're safe now." She blinked slowly, her lips dry and cracked. "Dad, I'm here," he said, brushing her forehead. "You're okay." Dr. Michaels leaned in. "She's stabilizing, but she'll need hospital care when we land. Anaphylaxis can have delayed rebounds." "We'll arrange it," Malcolm said, already pulling out his phone. "She'll be met at the gate." He looked up, addressing Carter. "Alert the captain. I want an emergency medical team on standby in Paris. No excuses." Carter nodded. "Yes, sir." As the flight continued, Malcolm remained by Zora's side, refusing to return to first class. The flight crew reorganized seating so that father and daughter could sit together, and passengers who had stayed silent earlier now offered words of support, or at least nervous eye contact acknowledging the gravity of what they had witnessed. But for Malcolm, this was no longer about a single flight. He was already thinking about what came next. Once Zora was safely resting against his arm, her breathing more regular, Malcolm opened his laptop. Within minutes, he had connected to the onboard Wi-Fi and accessed the internal server of Skyway Airlines. He opened the personnel files, pulled up Patricia Whitfield's name. The first thing he noticed made his blood run cold. 27 complaints, filed over 15 years, 11 referencing racial bias, all marked resolved, all closed with the same note, no corroborating evidence. Malcolm knew this pattern. He had seen it in boardrooms and HR departments, in compliance audits across every industry he'd ever acquired. It was a familiar, rot systemic, subtle, institutionalized, hidden beneath layers of plausible deniability and procedural jargon. It wasn't just Patricia, it was the system that enabled Patricia, and that system belonged to him now. Malcolm typed a single message to his chief of staff, Vanessa Chen, who was back at Skyway HQ in Atlanta. "We have a problem, and I'm going to fix it starting today." Across the aisle, Marcus Rivera leaned toward Malcolm. "Mr. Johnson, I recorded the whole thing, from the first call button to when she collapsed. If you need it, it's yours." Malcolm extended his hand. "Thank you. That recording may save more than just my daughter's life." He stood up and addressed the cabin. "I will be requesting full written statements from every passenger who witnessed what happened here. If you saw anything from her ignored request to how she was treated, I ask that you tell the truth." People nodded. Several hands went up immediately. Dorothy Chambers was one of the first to speak. She begged for water, she said clearly, her voice trembling with fury. 3 times. That woman ignored her because she thought she could. She thought no one would care about a little black girl in coach. Someone behind her whispered, "Amen." Malcolm turned to Carter again. "And you? How many complaints about her behavior have you seen?" "I just a few, I guess. How many did you report upward?" Silence. Don't know. That's what I thought." Malcolm's voice dropped again into that dangerous calm. "This airline failed my daughter, but I will not let it fail another child, not ever again." As the cabin filled with murmurs and side glances, the power of the moment was clear. This wasn't just about justice. This was the beginning of a reckoning. The plane hadn't landed, but the ground beneath Skyway Airlines had already begun to shake. Back in Atlanta, Vanessa Chen's inbox pinged with Malcolm's message, "We have a problem, and I'm going to fix it starting today." She didn't hesitate. Within minutes, she was on a secured conference call with legal, HR, and Skyway's recently appointed Chief Diversity Officer, Amani Washington. What began as a routine mid-air incident had become a corporate earthquake. In the air, Malcolm sat silently beside Zora, watching her chest rise and fall steadily now. His jaw remained clenched, his gaze cold and calculating. The pain in his daughter's eyes, the panic she must have felt as the call light was ignored not once, not twice, but 3 times haunted him. But beneath that fatherly anguish burned something far more dangerous: clarity. He now understood the depth of the rot. Patricia Whitfield wasn't a rogue actor. She was the product of a culture that licensed her behavior, a culture Skyway had allowed buried and shielded through years of silence and negligence. The passengers had seen it. The crew had seen it, and now the world was watching it unfold in real time. A few rows back, Marcus Rivera had just finished uploading the full video to his secure cloud. The footage was damning Zora's repeated pleas. Patricia's cold dismissals, her racially coded remarks whispered in the galley, and the precise moment Zora collapsed. Already the hashtags were trending. Skyway racism, Zora speaks justice in the air. Zora stirred, her voice barely audible. Dad, are people gonna believe me? Malcolm's hand closed around hers. The truth doesn't need to shout when the whole world is listening, Butterfly. And they are listening now. Meanwhile, Patricia sat in the crew rest area trying to piece together what had gone wrong. She had always played her cards carefully, smiling when she needed to, bending rules when it suited her, punishing passengers who didn't fit her image of respectable. She'd done this for years, and she'd gotten away with it every time. Until now. She hadn't recognized Zora, just another black child flying alone in premium economy, requesting water as if she were entitled to it. What Patricia hadn't realized, what her blind privilege wouldn't let her imagine, was that this entitled child was the only daughter of the man who owned the company. Her mistake wasn't just in denying Zora water, it was in assuming no one powerful enough to matter would care. In the economy cabin, things were shifting. Passengers who had sat in silence now began whispering among themselves, some in shame, others in outrage. The woman seated next to Dorothy Chambers, a retired schoolteacher, leaned in. I feel awful. I saw it all. I should have said something sooner. Dorothy turned to her with steely eyes. So say something now. From 2 rows back, Jameson Collins, a black entrepreneur returning from a conference, spoke up. This isn't the first time I've seen something like this. Just the first time there was a camera. More voices chimed in. She walked past that girl like she didn't exist. She told her the button was for real emergencies. How is not breathing not an emergency? Across the aisle, a young white woman whispered to her boyfriend, I thought it was just a kid being fidgety, but now I feel sick. Within moments, the cabin had transformed into something else, no longer. Just passengers on a transatlantic flight, but witnesses to a crime. The silence that had once allowed Patricia's microaggressions to go unchecked was gone. In its place was a growing sense of collective reckoning. Carter Wilson returned to the galley, his hands shaking slightly. The junior flight supervisor had always walked a thin line between obedience and apathy. He'd heard Patricia's comments before. He'd seen how she handled passengers of color differently, but he had said nothing. Until now. Back in his own seat, Malcolm Johnson was writing. He wasn't drafting press statements or legal memos, those would come later. What he was crafting was something far more dangerous to the old guard at Skyway, a plan. A structural audit of every discrimination complaint filed in the last 5 years. A review of every closed case marked unsubstantiated. A digital fingerprint search to trace who had read, deleted, or buried those files. And a new whistleblower hotline, external, encrypted, and directly overseen by Amani Washington's office. There would be no more hiding behind policy language. No more plausible deniability. No more silence. Olivia Chen, the flight attendant who had alerted Malcolm, approached again. Mr. Johnson, she said quietly, I just wanted you to know I saw Patricia turn off the call light on your daughter. I didn't know who she was at the time, but I knew it was wrong. If you need me to give a statement, I will. Malcolm looked her in the eye. Thank you. I will be collecting everything. Also, Olivia hesitated. There's something else. She leaned closer. There's been rumors about Patricia for years, not just from passengers. Staff too, especially younger Black and Asian crew. But HR always, Malcolm didn't blink. I know. He pulled out his phone again. Typed a message to Vanessa, start pulling HR suppression patterns. Search for key terms, racial bias, ignored complaints, retaliation. In the crew arrest area, Patricia was pacing now. Her confidence had crumbled. Her phone buzzed with messages from coworkers, but none offered support. She searched for Marcus's video, found it reposted across multiple platforms. Her face, once the image of smiling customer service, was now frozen in a frame that showed indifference, cruelty, and contempt. In Paris, reporters were already assembling at Charles de Gaulle Airport, tipped off by social media and leaks from Skyway staff. By the time the plane landed, the press would be waiting. Cameras, questions, headlines. Malcolm looked at Zora, whose eyes were beginning to close again from exhaustion. He whispered, rest now, baby. We've got work to do when we land. Outside the window, the clouds began to thin. The outline of the French coast appeared on the horizon. Just as it seemed was descending with them, the plane touched down with a soft thud at Charles de Gaulle Airport. But for Malcolm Johnson, the landing signaled not an arrival, but a mobilization. As Zora was rushed into the care of the waiting medical team, Malcolm moved with a purpose that startled even those who knew him well. He issued directives while walking on the phone with Vanessa Chen, coordinating with legal counsel, pausing only to reassure his daughter before she was taken to the American Hospital of Paris for overnight observation. He didn't flinch when French authorities boarded to investigate the incident. He welcomed them. "You'll find full cooperation here," he told Commander Laurent. "But this is more than a passenger complaint. This is a matter of life law and leadership." Back in Atlanta, Vanessa had already activated the internal audit team. That same morning, a data analyst named Sarah Okafor began building a network map from Skyway's own personnel files, cross-referencing employee names, dismissed complaints, patterns of passenger demographics in the supervisory chain of approvals. What she discovered was explosive. Of the 63 discrimination complaints filed in the past 2 years, 51 had been closed without a formal hearing. Of those, 40 involved either Patricia Whitfield directly or cabin crews under her watch. And nearly all had passed through the HR department of one Harrison Reynolds, the same board member, now quietly mobilizing to dilute Malcolm's controlling interest. Sarah stared at her screen, the web of connections looking less like data and more like a conspiracy. She flagged Vanessa. "You need to see this now." Within the hour, Malcolm's executive war room was fully operational from a conference suite in the Paris Ritz. Whiteboards, laptops, and call-ins from legal and media strategy teams filled the space. Vanessa Chen handled external communications while David Rios from legal focused on compliance and employment law. Amani Washington managed the ethics and DEI response, and Sarah Okafor oversaw the growing mountain of digital evidence. "We're not dealing with one bad apple," Sarah said, pointing to the data cluster highlighting Reynolds' involvement. "This is a culture of suppression, patterns of protectionism layered over bias." Patricia was never isolated. She was insulated. Malcolm stood silently for a moment before responding. "We're not just exposing her, we're mapping the ecosystem that allowed her to survive. And it ends now." Meanwhile, Carter Wilson, the junior flight supervisor who had stayed largely passive until now, made a decision that would alter the trajectory of the case. He called Skyway's HR compliance hotline and stated plainly, "I want to give a statement about Patricia Whitfield, and I have a recording." The audio recorded from his mobile device during a post-flight chat with Patricia captured damning statements. "They always pull the race card," she had said. "You give them water once and they'll ask for champagne the next time." There was no ambiguity, no room for plausible deniability. Carter's voice trembled as he played it back for HR, but he added one crucial point. "I stood by when I should have spoken up. This is my way of making that right." Back in Paris, Malcolm received a secured copy of the recording and added it to the growing folder titled Exoneration and Exposure. But the file wasn't just about defense, it was ammunition for reform. That evening, Malcolm sat beside Zora's hospital bed as she rested. He showed her the tablet displaying social media messages, thousands of supportive comments videos from children inspired by her courage, and a new movement growing under the hashtag Zora Taught Me. "Is it real, Dad?" she asked weakly. "Are they really listening?" Malcolm smiled softly. "They're not just listening, Butterfly. They're watching, and now they're following your lead." Meanwhile, Patricia Whitfield had finally realized she was not in control of her narrative. After her crew hotel was swarmed by journalists, she hastily arranged a press conference through a conservative media outlet, attempting to cast herself as the victim of reverse racism. She claimed she was targeted for not being woke enough. But just as the press conference began, her narrative began unraveling. News alerts interrupted the room. Skyway Airlines releases audio proving racist neglect by senior flight attendant. The video Marcus Rivera had uploaded hit 7 million views. Passengers had begun submitting their own footage and photos corroborating the timeline and Patricia's behavior. Even crew members like Olivia Chen and James Wilson provided formal written statements detailing the discriminatory culture Patricia cultivated on board. And that was just the beginning. A leaked internal report obtained by investigative journalist Maya Patel revealed Patricia had been the subject of 14 internal complaints in the past 5 years, most marked resolved without action. Many involved minority passengers. Some involved fellow flight attendants. All had been processed and dismissed by the same HR channel. The media had a new headline, Protected Prejudice, How Skyway Enabled 5 Years of Passenger Discrimination. In the Skyway boardroom, panic spread. Reynolds, who had tried to frame the incident as a PR problem, now faced deeper scrutiny. A whistleblower within the legal department leaked internal emails showing Reynolds had advised HR to de-escalate racially sensitive incidents quietly. He was directly linked to the suppression of Patricia's prior complaints. Malcolm received the emails and read them in silence. He then made the call. Prepare formal charges of gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty against Harrison Reynolds. We're not playing defense anymore. The first wave of legal filings hit the news cycle the next morning. Back in Paris, Malcolm drafted a letter to Skyway employees, passengers, and stakeholders. It read in part, "This is not about protecting my daughter. This is about protecting everyone's daughters, everyone's sons, everyone who has been mistreated and ignored because they didn't fit someone's idea of who deserves respect. Skyway will become the gold standard for equity, or it will cease to exist." Meanwhile, Zora looked up from her hospital bed and whispered, "Can I go back to school next week?" Malcolm looked at her, pride and pain mingling in his expression. "If you're strong enough, yes. But when you go back, know that you'll be walking in with an army behind you." Outside, the Eiffel Tower shimmered in the distance. But the real monument to progress was being built not in stone, but in courage and data and policy and truth. The gathering of evidence was complete. The reckoning was coming. It was dawn in Atlanta when Malcolm Johnson's private jet landed on the tarmac of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. The city hadn't yet stirred awake, but inside Skyway Airlines headquarters, a tempest was brewing. The boardroom lights were already on, and the old guard had gathered, nervous, divided, calculating. Malcolm didn't walk in alone. He arrived with Vanessa Chen, his chief of staff, Amani Washington, now acting EVP of Culture and Inclusion, David Rios, lead counsel, and Sarah Okafor, armed with the data dashboard that had unveiled years of willful ignorance. They walked shoulder to shoulder, a silent formation of resolve. Outside the boardroom, news trucks lined the sidewalk, and journalists were setting up for the 10 a.m. press briefing. Word had leaked overnight the majority owner of Skyway Airlines was about to confront his own board over systemic racial discrimination, and the world was watching. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Harrison Reynolds sat at the head of the table, flanked by his closest allies. Others looked pale, shifting uneasily in their seats. The chairs weren't just filled with people, they were filled with factions. Malcolm stood at the opposite end of the table and remained silent until every eye turned toward him. "Let's get to it," he said. Reynolds leaned back. "Mr. Johnson, we've reviewed the social media damage. We agree a statement is necessary, but let's not overcorrect. You've been emotional." "We all sympathize," Malcolm raised a single finger. "This isn't about emotion, it's about evidence." He nodded to Sarah, who tapped the screen behind him. Up came a network diagram showing complaint flow, red lines indicating unresolved reports. Then came audio clips beginning with Patricia's casual racism and ending with Reynolds' own words, "Handle it quietly." These types of complaints are bad for morale. A few gasps echoed. One board member visibly recoiled. Vanessa stepped forward. "We've traced 63 complaints over 2 years, with 80% either dismissed or redirected by internal counsel, every single one tied to the same review chain." Another slide showed the suppressive pattern, ending with a summary of Reynolds' exact interventions, emails, approvals, meetings. Reynolds scoffed. "Emails taken out of context. You don't understand how these decisions get made." "I understand conflict of interest," David Rios interjected. "And we're prepared to submit this to the Securities and Exchange Commission. You knowingly withheld discrimination complaints from shareholders. That's material risk, potentially criminal." "You wouldn't dare," Reynolds snapped. "I already have," Malcolm replied, calm and chilling. "Which is why this meeting is your last chance at dignity." The room fell silent. Reynolds opened his mouth, but Victoria Hartwell, a board member who had been undecided until now, cut him off. "I received a message last night from my granddaughter. She's the same age as Zora. She asked if I would have helped her. I couldn't answer." Then she turned to Malcolm. "I vote we adopt the accountability framework and restructure the board." Another voice followed, then another. Even Reynolds' longtime ally Gerard Price crossed the aisle. The vote passed 6-3. Malcolm stood and looked Reynolds in the eye. "You have a choice, Harrison. Public resignation with severance, or we hand over this data to federal regulators and you explain it under oath." Reynolds' expression shifted from arrogance to understanding. He had lost. Completely. "I'll resign," he muttered. "No, you'll say why," Malcolm replied, "at the press conference." Reynolds hesitated. "If you don't, I will," Malcolm said plainly. An hour later, the press conference began. Camera lights flared. Reporters leaned in. Malcolm took the podium with Zora watching from backstage alongside Vanessa and Amani. "6 weeks ago, my daughter nearly died on one of our flights. But this isn't about one child or one flight attendant. This is about an entire system of silence and disregard that allowed it to happen." He pointed behind him to the board members standing now in a line symbolic shamed. "This is Harrison Reynolds. He has agreed to resign and issue a statement explaining his role in suppressing over 60 verified complaints." Reynolds stepped up, hands shaking. The moment of reckoning had arrived. "I was wrong," he said. "I let fear of disruption justify the protection of discriminatory behavior. I failed the passengers. I failed this company." Flashbulbs popped. The public narrative shifted in real time from damage control to full-blown institutional reform. Later that day, Malcolm returned to Zora's hospital room. She had been released, but remained under observation in Atlanta. "How did it go?" she asked, trying to sit up. "You've changed an airline butterfly." She smiled faintly. "I just wanted a glass of water." Malcolm knelt beside her bed. "And you turned it into justice." What began as a refusal to hand a child water at 35,000 feet had now become a global reckoning. Boardrooms were shifting, employees were being retrained. Airlines around the world were calling Skyway for their policy blueprint. But Malcolm knew the real confrontation was not just against Patricia or Reynolds or even the board. It was against a legacy. And that war was far from over. The following morning, the Skyway Airlines executive floor was a landscape of movement security badges, revoked resignation letters, drafted compliance officers rerouted from routine audits to emergency debriefs. The air was no longer crisp with ambition. It was charged with confession. Malcolm Johnson stood at the glass wall of his corner office, staring out over the Atlanta skyline. It was only 7:30 a.m., but he'd been up since 4. The confrontation with the board had succeeded, but the real machinery, the systemic structures that allowed bias to embed itself, were still operating in full. Today, they would collapse. "I've already cleared the 9 a.m., Vanessa Chen said, walking in with a thick stack of files. "You're going to want to see this." She handed him a digital tablet with the latest whistleblower submissions from the new anonymous portal he'd established after the public unveiling of the Skyway Accountability Initiative. Over 200 complaints had come in within 36 hours. Some described outright racism from flight attendants and crew. Others revealed that mid-level supervisors routinely altered evaluations to favor white employees. One woman detailed how she had been told to whiten her name when applying for an internal promotion. All of them echoed one chilling fact: the company's internal HR process had functioned less like a shield and more like a smokescreen. "There's no bottom to this, is there?" Malcolm murmured. "No," Amani Washington said, entering behind Vanessa. "But now we dig until there is." Across town, Patricia Whitfield sat in the dim dining room of a friend's apartment, watching her name trend in headlines. Suspended flight attendants' record shows years of misconduct buried by executives. The press conference had made her infamous, but the release of internal documents and authenticated recordings of her own words had sealed her fate. Her phone was off, her agent had dropped her. Her union had issued a neutral statement. And Blake Thornton, the media pundit, who had once courted her as a symbol of white victimhood, had quietly scrubbed all interviews from his platform. They had all used her as a pawn and discarded her just as fast. But Patricia still clung to her last illusion. "This is political," she whispered to herself. "This is overcorrection." She turned to her reflection in the window, but for the first time she didn't recognize the woman looking back. At Skyway headquarters, Malcolm convened the largest all-hands meeting in company history. Over 700 employees, crew pilots, staff joined via video from offices and lounges across the globe. He didn't open with corporate speak. He didn't thank them for their time. He simply began. 6 weeks ago, my daughter Zora had a medical emergency on board one of our flights. But that flight didn't just reveal one person's poor judgment, it revealed a culture. Silence. Not of evil, he said, but of permission. Permission to look away. Permission to ignore certain complaints. Permission to let silence do the dirty work. He stepped closer to the camera. Today that culture ends, not through words, but through dismantling every mechanism that allowed it to survive. One by one, he listed the changes taking effect. The dismantling of the old HR complaint process, the establishment of an independent ombudsman office, and transparent publishing of quarterly complaint resolutions. Executive compensation now directly tied to bias incident metrics. The complete audit of hiring, promotion, and review cycles for equity analysis. And finally, effective immediately, any employee who knowingly suppressed discrimination claims will be placed on leave pending investigation. That same afternoon, legal teams visited multiple senior offices. One manager tried to shred his files, security stopped him. Another wept openly as she handed over a USB with years of suppressed cases. The dam was breaking. Skyway's stock dipped again. Analysts were nervous, but inside the airline, something extraordinary began to happen. Employees started coming forward voluntarily, not just with complaints, but with solutions. A Latina pilot offered to lead inclusive training for cockpit crews. An openly gay gate agent suggested a mentorship program. A veteran flight attendant who once feared speaking up now volunteered for the culture task force. The system was cracking, but it was also being rebuilt in real time. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the Department of Transportation had announced an investigation into airline industry-wide discrimination complaints. Citing Skyway's model, they were now drafting new federal reporting standards for passenger rights violations with mandatory publication of resolution outcomes. Congressional hearings were scheduled. Malcolm was invited to testify. "Are you ready for that level of exposure?" Vanessa asked as they reviewed the invite. He nodded. "If we don't lead now, someone else with less integrity will." That night, Malcolm returned home to find Zora waiting in the living room, curled up with a book on Thurgood Marshall. "You're reading about the Supreme Court?" he asked. She smiled, trying to understand what real change looks like. He sat beside her. "It looks like hard days, a lot of enemies, and a few moments, just a few, when you realize someone's life will be better because you didn't back down." She looked up at him. "Is the system fixed?" He shook his head. "But it's breaking, and we're replacing the pieces before they can repair themselves." Zora leaned her head on his shoulder. Outside, the city buzzed with headlines. Across social media, hashtags like Zora Strong and Reform Takes Flight were trending in over 20 countries. But in that quiet living room, there was no victory dance. Just two people sitting in the center of a collapsed machine building something that might finally work. Part 9, The Rebirth and Reform. When justice finds its wings, just 2 weeks after Skyway Airlines publicly launched the Skyway Accountability Initiative, the industry felt the aftershocks. 3 major U.S. airlines announced rapid reviews of their own anti-discrimination policies. International carriers quietly reached out to Skyway's team requesting their compliance frameworks. What had started as a crisis was quickly becoming a blueprint. Malcolm Johnson, however, remained cautious. "Change doesn't stick unless it survives resistance," he told his leadership team in a Monday morning briefing. And resistance is coming. It came in waves. The first was legal. Patricia Whitfield's attorneys filed a wrongful termination suit. Conservative news outlets swarmed the narrative with fresh spins that Skyway had bent to public pressure, that Malcolm had weaponized race and power. The term executive overreach began appearing in trade publications. The second was internal. A small but vocal group of senior staff submitted a joint letter questioning the legitimacy of the reform initiative. Among the signatories were 2 vice presidents who had long operated under the protection of Harrison Reynolds. They argued the new performance metrics were subjective, that inclusion goals were anti-meritocratic. Malcolm didn't flinch. He called an emergency executive review. Each signer of the letter was asked to sit individually with the company's new independent ethics panel, a third-party entity made up of former judges, civil rights attorneys, and DEI experts. The findings were clear. A culture of passive complicity and active resistance had defined their leadership for years. All but one resigned voluntarily within a week. At the same time, Zora Johnson began navigating her own rebirth. Returning to middle school as the girl who exposed the airline came with unexpected complexity. Some teachers praised her bravery, others kept their distance. Students were either inspired, curious, or cruel. Online forums, some anonymous, spread rumors, memes, and nasty commentary about her race, her father, her story. It was Lily Chen, her best friend, who helped her reclaim the narrative. We should turn all that into something powerful, Lily suggested one afternoon. You know, like an initiative. By kids. For kids. Zora liked the sound of that. So they began drafting the outline of what they called the Altitude Initiative, a student-led program designed to teach young people how to recognize bias, advocate for themselves, and support peers facing discrimination. They shared it with their principal, then their school board, then a local education foundation. By the end of the month, 5 schools had signed on. Malcolm heard about it from Zora over dinner. "You're launching a nonprofit," he asked, half amused, half impressed. She nodded. "If grown-ups can change companies, kids can change classrooms." He grinned. "Fair enough. You'll need a board, funding, legal structure." "I figured you'd help with that," she replied with a knowing look. He laughed. "Of course. But it's your mission, Butterfly. I'm just the pilot." Meanwhile, Patricia Whitfield's trajectory continued its descent. The lawsuit she'd filed against Skyway was floundering. Her legal team had underestimated the depth of evidence gathered by Malcolm's office. Authenticated recordings, sworn witness statements, documentation of past complaints, all revealing a long-standing pattern of racially biased behavior. In court, her attempt to claim she had merely followed procedure collapsed when Carter Wilson's transcripts were read aloud. She had, in her own words, ignored the brat until she learned to wait like everyone else. The judge denied her motion for dismissal. On the courthouse steps, Patricia faced the cameras again. "They're trying to erase me," she said bitterly. "This isn't justice, this is vengeance." But the world had moved on. The story was no longer about her. It was about Skyway, about a company that had nearly failed its most vulnerable passenger, and then rebuilt itself to make sure it never happened again. Inside Skyway headquarters, Malcolm was preparing for the company's first public shareholder forum since the incident. Investors were tense but curious. The company's stock had stabilized, but legal liabilities loomed. Would Malcolm double down on reform or retreat to traditional business conservatism? The forum began with cautious applause. Malcolm stepped up to the stage without a script. "6 months ago, my daughter almost died on one of our planes. The cause wasn't just negligence. It was a culture. A system. One built not from malice, but from decades of habits left unchallenged." He let the silence settle. "Some asked if the damage to our stock, our brand, and our employee morale would be worth what we're trying to do. My answer is simple. Yes." He outlined the results of the first internal audit. Discrimination complaint resolution time had decreased by 78%. Employee satisfaction in marginalized groups had jumped 34%. 61% of passengers surveyed said they chose Skyway specifically because of its public reforms. Then came the mic drop: profit matters, but dignity is non-negotiable. And where those two values intersect, that's where Skyway will lead. The room erupted in applause. Back home that night, Zora showed him the Altitude Initiative's first official newsletter. It included stories from other kids around the country who had faced discrimination, from lunchline insults to classroom exclusion, and how they responded with courage. One quote stood out. A 13-year-old boy in Chicago wrote, "I didn't think my voice mattered until I saw Zora use hers." Malcolm's throat tightened. "You're changing lives, Butterfly," he said softly. "So are you," she replied. As spring dawned, Skyway Airlines unveiled a new motto across every aircraft, billboard, and digital platform: "Everyone deserves to fly with dignity." It wasn't just a slogan, it was a vow. From the ashes of silence and bias, something honest and human had taken flight. 6 months had passed since Zora Johnson's flight had sparked a reckoning in the skies. What began as a single moment of breathless desperation from a 12-year-old girl denied water had grown into a nationwide conversation on race power and institutional accountability. And now, in a moment few could have predicted, the story of that fateful flight was about to be etched into the cultural memory of a generation. At the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., an audience of diplomats, CEOs, activists, educators, and journalists gathered for the Global Justice and Inclusion Summit. On the main stage, Zora Johnson, just 13 years old, stood behind the podium, wearing a simple blue blazer and a pin that read Altitude Initiative. She took a deep breath, looked out over the crowd, and spoke with clarity that silenced the room. 6 months ago, I was just a kid on a plane. I asked for water. I was told to wait. I asked again. I was ignored. I pressed the button. I was punished. I begged. I collapsed. Her voice caught for a moment, but she didn't falter. I didn't know then that one small voice mine could make anything change. I thought I'd be blamed. I thought people would say I overreacted, and some did. She paused, scanning the crowd. But more people believed me, and they acted. And that's why I'm here. Zora's words rippled like electricity through the audience. From her seat in the front row, Dorothy Chambers, the elderly passenger who had stood up for her on the plane, dabbed her eyes. Malcolm Johnson sat beside her, his hand clenched with quiet pride. The speech, streamed live across multiple networks, became an instant flashpoint in American discourse. Commentators across ideological lines weighed in. Some called it a masterclass in emotional intelligence. Others tried unsuccessfully to frame it as overdramatization. But most people simply called it what it was: truth. The Altitude Initiative saw a surge in funding overnight. 15 new school districts adopted the program within a week. Requests came in from Australia, Kenya, and Canada. Zora's name trended again, not as a victim this time, but as a symbol of change. Meanwhile, at Skyway Airlines, Malcolm implemented the final phase of his reform. The Independent Oversight Board began operating with full autonomy. The Passenger Equity Index, a monthly report tracking disparities in service across race, gender, and disability, was published openly. The Skyway's HR portal added a new section: if you were ignored, you were not imagining it. It included stories from passengers and staff affirming their experiences, validating their voices, and offering resources. Even the FAA began taking notes. But not everyone embraced the transformation. On fringe media channels, Patricia Whitfield resurfaced in a final televised appearance. Her lawsuit had failed her, reputation was in ruins, and her legal defenses had been dismantled by the weight of recordings and witness testimonies. In her interview, she clung to her narrative of being a scapegoat for political correctness. But this time the public didn't rally. Even her former allies distanced themselves. The world had moved forward, and she had stayed behind. On a quiet Sunday morning, Malcolm and Zora walked together through a museum in Atlanta. The Civil Rights exhibit had added a new interactive wing titled Voices of Now. There in one corner, a screen played the video of Zora's speech from the Kennedy Center. Next to it stood a display case. Inside was her original boarding pass from seat 14B, a simple piece of paper, but now a national artifact. Zora stared at it for a long moment. "You think it's weird?" she asked. "Being part of history?" Malcolm smiled. "Only if you forget you were always meant to be." She took his hand. "I still remember how small I felt that day," she whispered. Malcolm squeezed her fingers. "And now I don't feel small anymore." At Skyway's annual shareholder meeting, Malcolm was re-elected chairman with unanimous support. He closed the event not with financial forecasts, but with a single photo. It showed Zora mid-speech, hands slightly raised, eyes focused, a backdrop of flags behind her. "This is why we lead," Malcolm said. "Not for profit alone, not for market share, but for the people who trust us with their lives, for the voices that were once ignored, for the future they represent." The room stood in ovation. Not for numbers, for purpose. In homes across the country, children watched Zora's video in classrooms. Employees watched it during company training. Her face became part of murals in school hallways, not as a martyr, but as a reminder that no one is too young or too voiceless to be heard. That injustice doesn't need permission to be confronted, and that real change doesn't come from one dramatic moment. It comes when people choose to build systems that prevent injustice from repeating itself. As the sun set on another day in Atlanta, Zora sat on the porch beside her father, a book in her lap and a firefly hovering in the warm evening air. "Do you think we changed anything, really?" she asked quietly. Malcolm didn't answer immediately. He pointed to the street where two neighborhood girls were laughing, one black, one white, playing under a banner that read, "Zora taught me." "I think we did more than change something," he said. "I think we started something." She nodded, the kind of nod that means a story isn't over. It's just begun. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch more gripping stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.